thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about some work we've been doing on behalf of the Users TCP and 4E EDNA group, essentially looking at the role of usability as a deterrent to smart home technologies performing as optimally as they might do. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Energy Systems Catapult, sorry, my slide's not changing. Oh, there we go. So I work for an organisation in the UK called Energy Systems Catapult. Their role broadly is to tie together different parts of the energy sector, sort of innovators, government, policymakers, academia. There's a broad range of capabilities, but our nutshell is to take a broad kind of whole systems view of the energy challenges and try and bring everyone together in a way to tackle these issues. Now, smart home technologies have been championed for some time as being a way to help reduce carbon emissions. This is because they can promote the efficient operation of various home technologies. They can allow things like demand flexibility, and they offer status reporting. But the potential is not being realised in the domestic sector at present. So what we've done is we've gone off and conducted an evidence review to try and understand, what role poor usability is playing in this. Now, the approach that we took, we interviewed a range of industry experts across the sector to get their expert opinion on the matter. We obviously sought out relevant evidence to review, and we looked at some other sectors for examples of, good practice when bringing emerging technologies to market to see what lessons could be learned in that respect. Now, in a nutshell, there are many different usability issues that prevent smart devices performing efficiently in the home. In particular, the evidence points to issues with how smart home technologies are communicated in the first instance. Effectively, there's a bit of a letdown for customers, which causes distrust and ultimately means they're less willing to engage with the technology and act on the feedback. Smart home technologies tend to not to cater to diverse needs and wants of users. There tends to be, one size fits all approach, which means that a lot of people aren't necessarily getting what they need from the technology. The onboarding experience often fails to prepare users to operate their technologies. So, the errors made during installation also exacerbate this issue because the feedback that people are getting is less accurate, or sometimes their ability to access the technology is inhibited in some way, shape, or form. And automation. So automation does offer a lot of promise in the area, but there's some usability issues in this respect, ultimately, that users don't like to feel like they're not in control. And when automation is deployed poorly, it undermines the customer's trust in the product, and they tend to intervene, which prevents the technology optimizing or running optimally, basically. There's a few considerations with regards to the review. So uptake of smart home technologies is relatively low at present. It tends to be early adopters for some technologies, and I'll go into a bit more detail on this later on, but some of the experts from private industry suggested that their businesses didn't see any value in publicizing any errors made when they've tried to bring products to market. So that means that there's a bit of an inability to learn from that area about what has and hasn't worked so well. The experts, I think, to a man, suggested that usability is not an immediate priority for the sector at present. It's not that it's unimportant. It's just that it's not top of the list essentially at the moment. Better usability will evolve, of course. As those that are offering their customers better experiences will naturally gain better market share. But this type of thing will take time to happen. It's not going to be a quick process. The climate emergency, of course, means that we can't really sit around and wait for this to occur naturally, and we'd have to take steps to seek out the issues and address them before wider scale adoption of these technologies. Now, if we do this now, it's going to increase the likelihood that the smart home technologies will be able to make a meaningful contribution to the climate emergency through reduced emissions, effectively. So for the expert interviews, we spoke to 12 experts across 10 organizations in 4 different countries. These were flexible energy platform providers, network aggregators, infrastructure distribution experts, energy suppliers, installers, business strategy professionals, innovators and startups, consumer groups, system engineers, and user interface and standards experts. For the actual evidence reviews, we worked with the Users TCP group and for EDNA to define the criteria for inclusion within the review. We also asked the experts that we interviewed if they could, direct us to any evidence that we should be considering. Now, in addition to being of sufficient quality and being a relatively recent publication, the sources also had to cover a technology that was relevant. You've got the list of them there, but it's your batteries, your smart appliances, your thermostats, your electric vehicle chargers, etc. And it has to have some focus on the end user experience. So for example, it could be a usability review, an ergonomics report, some kind of consumer trial. And just a point of clarification, it is has to be based on experience of actual use. So there are a lot of studies out there which look at how consumers perceive a technology, but with no actual experience of use, and which those papers are not relevant for this piece of work. So one of the bigger issues is the miscommunication of the benefits. So smart home technologies are primarily marketed as a way to help people, reduce their energy bills and subsequently, their emissions. The evidence, however, suggests that the benefits are negligible and they're only specific to certain types of user. So the reasons for this are quite wide-ranging, but increasing energy bills, seasonal variability, poor energy bill understanding, all these type of factors make it very difficult for the end user to observe any benefit. A high initial outlay, of course, is another kind of means it would take some time to pay off the investment as well. And user suitability, I mean, that tends to be, people that can consume, people in efficient homes or people that are able to consume most of their energy outside peak hours, this type of thing. So ultimately what happens is when users realize that the technology isn't able to give them, what they want, the very reason they purchased it in the first instance, they disengage, they become frustrated, they stop engaging with the technology, they use it less often. They then stop seeing the feedback, which prevents them acting on the, on the suggestions to optimize the system's operation. And furthermore, this poor experience also kind of shuts them off to other opportunities like flexible energy delivery programs. It means that they're less willing to engage with the concept and try these types of things out. User needs are very complicated and diverse, but it's not common for smart systems to offer multiple user profiles. It tends to be, as I touched on before, a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm not going to go through the full list of different variations there, but as you can see, I mean, it's a huge range of lists, and all of these are said to impact ultimately, what people want from the systems. The added complexity to this is people's needs are not static, of course, they change over time. So, for example, people need a lot of support and advice up front as they become more familiar with the technology. They don't need so much support if they get a high bill, if there's a software update, if there's a technical issue, they need more information again. There are some seasonal variability issues, so you might stop using your heating for 6 months of the year, 10 months of the year, whatever, and forget how to do certain things. So ultimately, there needs to be some flexibility in the information that's presented to the end user. These factors all kind of influence the user's experience with the technology, so what support they need from it, what they're trying to get from it, and ultimately how successful they consider the technology. If the smart technology is not catering to their specific needs, it can be reputationally damaging, and it can mean that the products are used less often, which means that their contribution is far lower than it might be. There are a number of issues which can occur at installation. The installations can, either be complicated or at very least appear complicated, which can intimidate users. It's because they become reluctant to engage once the installations complete because they're intimidated by it. The household conditions are variable, so often when you're developing a product, perfect conditions are assumed in a laboratory condition. Obviously, we don't all live in perfect homes. People have different efficiency in the property. They have different quality of internet connection. There's various logistical issues that prevent the device, running optimally, basically. There's various aesthetical issues. So people might not want devices placed in certain parts of their home. However, they do have to be quite prominent and visible to provide the feedback that's provided. If they're positioned out of sight, then of course the opportunities to kind of act on that feedback are far less. In some cases, the technologies are simply just installed poorly. So there was reports of things like people not wanting to repaint a wall. So they asked for the thermostat to be new thermostat to be positioned in the same location as the old thermostat. Again, if people want to put these things in cupboards sometimes, they don't have to look at them, or certainly not, in the most occupied room, sort of front and center. That there's a few people that sort of disagreed with that. Now, often the users aren't given any sort of training or how to, support and how to set up the devices. The user interfaces can mean they feel quite overwhelmed, especially if it doesn't follow what they perceive to be a logical flow. Because the users feel overwhelmed, they become reluctant to deviate from what they've set up. So if they've set the system up to work in a way that provides them mostly what they need, or something that's decent rather than great, then they tend to stick to it because they're wary if they start to experiment, they cannot easily revert back to this previous sort of okay experience they were having previously. Obviously, households are made up of multiple occupants, and occupants have different needs. And ultimately, if you are setting the system up to meet one person's needs, by default, you may be setting it up in a way that doesn't meet somebody else's need. And in some cases, there's poor understanding. So if the system operates in standby mode, performs crucial functions while in standby mode, but they don't understand this, they may switch the device off entirely, which is ultimately contributing to inefficient operation. There's the automation paradox. So there's a bit of a trade-off where ultimately users don't want to feel burdened to have to take too many decisions from the smart device. However, they want to feel fully in control. And basically, the experts, the evidence reviewed, all kind of felt that automation is going to play a key role in efficient operation. But if it's poorly deployed, you're basically turning customers off the notion. So the lack of control causes users to intervene if they don't understand what the system is doing. This is quite common in things like flexible energy delivery. So if a home is being heated overnight when there's lots of renewable electricity available, they feel the system is costing them money, ignoring what they've asked for, and it can cause them to try and trick it effectively, which again prevents the system running optimally. So they might, for example, there were reports of people shutting doors so the heating would be retained better and the system would be quieter overnight. There are issues where people left windows open to try and trick the system, or there was all sorts of things being disconnected just because the customer felt that the system was ignoring their wishes effectively. Now, because automation can be perceived as wasteful, that leads to people distrusting what it's doing. Actually, automation can be more wasteful as well. So automated lighting might switch off after a period of inactivity, but a manual switch goes off the moment a room is vacated. And I think the reality of the situation, obviously, user behavior isn't easily rationalized. There's only so much that automation can do. User preference might vary based on the circumstances. You might, for example, in most instances, prefer to prioritize cost savings. But you might have a guest over one day, and in those circumstances, you might be quite willing to spend more money and want to prioritize comfort. But of course, automation doesn't know this. And also sometimes what the user want might contradict what's best for efficient operation, which makes it very difficult for the system to ultimately decide what to do, because it's a moving target effectively. So there's a few good practices that can be implemented to address these issues. So ultimately, be wary of promoting smart home technologies solely as a means to reduce energy bills. So a broader range of benefits, such as greater comfort, better convenience, this type of thing should be promoted. You should aim to establish if users suitable prior to installation. So if they are suboptimal and they're not expected to make significant savings, they should be offered sort of additional support to maximize the opportunity to see some sort of benefit, even if it's a smaller one. So the organizations need to be better integrated. One of the bigger issues, I think, is that certainly from the expert's perspective, is there's a disconnect between the people developing the product and the people selling the product. Ultimately, the people selling the product or selling it based on what they think people will buy, rather than what the technology can feasibly deliver ultimately. And there's a bit of a lack of synchronization there, which can lead to difficulties. Products should be intuitive wherever possible. Of course, you don't have to go on a training course to learn how to use a new mobile phone, for example, and ultimately that's the holy grail that we'd want to aim for with the smart home technologies. But there may be a need for a wider sector discussion to boost awareness about how smart home technologies can contribute to the climate crisis. But businesses will have to find a way to help users understand how to set up the products so they can experience the benefits, basically. Now, the issue with diverse and sort of dynamic user needs means it's an impossible task, effectively, to set up one user interface that's going to magically cater to everybody's needs. Ultimately, what you want to do is allow people to have a bespoke experience. So this could consist of multiple user profile types, essentially, for different people in the house, and they can tailor the experience to suit, the information that they want to see, for example, which consequently would boost engagement and they would be able to react more often to the feedback. Implementing standards into user interface design is an important one. So a lot of the issues with navigating and lack of confidence using different operating systems were because of things like lack of signposting, no ability to kind of undo what you've done and revert back to your previous settings. There was no kind of measure in place. There was an inconsistent kind of iconography and terminology, and effectively these things, studies have shown, are a way to give customers that extra bit of confidence to go in and experiment with the system to figure out how to get what they want from it. And the user interface should always facilitate the adoption of convenient behaviors. So we shouldn't be overly demanding of what you're asking the user to do. It's, you shouldn't, for example, be in any way reliant on memory to operate a system. So you should be thinking of both cognitive and practical workload that you're asking the user to do for any requests that are forthcoming from the system. Now, in terms of automation, I think the key message certainly from the literature is that customers aren't worried that its product is automated. They are worried that the automation will prevent them getting what they want. So ultimately, the automation can still have to decide how to deliver the outcome that they've requested, but the user wants the ability to override this if they disagree, essentially. So in terms of deploying better automation, you want to look at things like allowing users to retain the option to take control if they want it. You should be seeking ultimately to augment user engagement rather than take over for them. You should seek to understand what users want to take control of and when. And this is probably one of the trickiest things to get right. If you're asking them too often, then you're perhaps setting yourself up for them to override more often. If you're not asking them enough, then you're not getting them to act on the feedback. And it's a tricky balance, but ultimately we need to seek to understand what balance is most optimal for that. System behaviors have to be made transparent to the user if they're to believe that what's happening is correct. So if we do want to, heat, just use the example I mentioned earlier on, if we want to heat homes when there's lots of renewable electricity on the grid, we have to somehow inform the user that's what's happening so they know that the system hasn't malfunctioned in some sort of way and it's a legitimate process. And in some cases, it's a balance between the both. So you might, for example, prompt the user to switch a light off by, turn a device off by flashing a light. But if they haven't turned it off after a certain period of time, then automation can deactivate it remotely. Now, in the expert interviews, the kind of key theme that came across was that it's not the usability is unimportant, but it's certainly not a priority at the moment. Now, the reasons for this broadly is there's a lot of uncertainty in the energy sector at present. They feel there needs to be more assurances and things like that the infrastructure will be in place and the longevity of emerging technologies before they can justify investing money. And ultimately, if they invest in something that goes on to become a defunct technology, it does become widely adopted, that's obviously a risk to the commercial interests of the organization. The market rewards are not in place, so specifically in the context of demand side flexibility. The current arrangements don't offer significant rewards for those that are taking part in it. It's more sensible, they felt, to invest in the commercial sector at present, as the domestic one isn't ready yet. The business case to conform is weak, which was the perception of a lot of the experts from private industry. So the reason for this is, brand identity is important. How can you stand out from your rivals if there's no way to distinguish you from one another? If you're offering interoperability, there's risks there. There's commercial risk, there's reputational risk, there's technical risk. Why would we do this? What is the reason for us to conform? And ultimately, and it's expensive, of course, as well. So to do user testing, as I mentioned, user needs are very diverse and complicated. To ultimately build something that is optimal, that's going to require a lot of investment. So it's the business case there to kind of figure out this type of stuff and do it is a poor one, effectively. And some feel that situation will resolve over time. I think I touched on this earlier on. We've seen it in other markets. Those who offer their customers a better experience, they will likely gain a bigger market share. But this takes time. It's not an instant thing. It takes time. It's when customers complain. It's when they return products to the shop, when they stop buying them altogether. In some instances, might be the driver for change to occur. And obviously, given the climate crisis, it's not really a luxury that we have available to us. Now, the issue of interoperability was something that we'd anticipated going to this review would be something that would come up quite often. It's important because if people live in increasingly complicated homes, but where the smart home technologies can't work seamlessly together, that's offering a bad user experience and potentially a suboptimal operation. But the issues this didn't really come up in the evidence, and largely this was for two kind of main reasons. So the nature of the evidence available tended to be largely academic. So these tended to be trials run in laboratory settings, which might use a prototype or something that's been built deliberately for the project. In some instances, it was lab settings. You might get a couple of users to go and stay in a smart home for a couple of weeks to learn about their experiences, in which case the user is not having to learn how to integrate the technology into their home. And of course, when the experiment did take part in the home, it was largely professional installation. I think the fact that professional installation is required for smart home technologies is itself a symptom of a sector that's generally does not have a large focus on user experience. And on the other side, as I mentioned before, private industry, they felt, well, if I promote the mistakes that I have made as a commercial organization when I've tried to bring a product to market, again, that offers a lot of risk. So your commercial rivals are going to benefit from the expensive lessons that you've made, and it can be reputationally damaging ultimately. And as we sort of mentioned earlier on, smart home technology uptake at the moment is relatively low. It is projected, however, to increase in the coming years. And as uptake increases, it's likely that the issues owing to lack of interoperability will become much better known. But again, that's the point that we're kind of hoping that smart home technologies will be able to contribute to reduced emissions. So we can't really wait until uptake increases. We need to take steps now to nip it in the bud. So looking into other sectors to kind of understand the process of how to successfully diffuse a new technology innovation to the market, they've suggested it's important to take a whole system approach. So that includes considering the non-technical parts of the system, i.e. people. And that's because a change in one part of the system can impact other parts in the system in quite complicated and dynamic ways. So effectively, when we integrate technology into existing systems, it's not just about making technical adjustments. We're looking at organizational behavioral adjustments as well. And the challenge is going to be that policymakers and regulators, if they can find a way to design a managed system that can support these needs, then effectively the energy sector could see a similar degree of success to other sectors which have taken this same approach, with telecoms being the obvious one. And failure to consider all these aspects of the system can ultimately lead to issues with the technology being accepted and issues with how it's used, which means it's not going to be able to contribute in the way that we hope it might. So several factors have been identified as influencing how likely somebody is to accept to purchase a technology. These include how much it costs, social influences, technology self-efficacy, system design features, how useful it's perceived to be, and how easy it appears to be to use. So perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use are basically quite consistently shown across a variety of technologies as being an important predictor of eventual acceptance in use. So ease of use, just to clarify, is the extent to which the user experiences it to be efficient, effective, and satisfying, and effectively that it will be free from effort to use. Perceived usefulness is a measure of how much the user believes using the system will help them or improve their life in some way, shape, or form. Many things influence this, but it's ultimately it's the extent to which you can be integrated, including the extent to which it will be integrated to existing technologies and practices, i.e. interoperability. Now, cast your mind back to when the first web-enabled camera phones came to market. The uptake of them was initially quite slow, and research showed this was largely owing to poor usability. So things like lack of interoperability. So if you cast your mind back when the first mobile phones launched, there was a limited number of email clients that you could use on them. Lots of websites were not mobile phone friendly. The operating systems were inconsistent. It was one smartphone was quite different to another, and sometimes it was difficult to find your way around. They were quite big and clunky devices as well. And ultimately, all these issues meant that fewer people were buying them. And of course, specifically in the context of mobile phones, if fewer people own the device, then you've got fewer people that you can email or phone call, which again reduces their usefulness, that lack of critical mass. And wider scale adoption of the web-enabled phones only occurred when both usability and the infrastructure issues were resolved. And this process ultimately revealed new and unexpected uses people were getting from these devices as they incorporated them into their daily lives. So in a complex system like the Energy system, it's impossible to understand all implications of use before it's been deployed. Before these technologies of wide-scale adoption takes place, we're not going to be able to predict everything or every kind of way that they're going to be useful in people's lives. By conducting kind of user research, we can help discover, what the emergent requirements are, but also any unanticipated value. And once we know what this value is, we can promote these features that offer value to users, which is going to be key in driving up early adoption. There's obviously a need for this development and uptake to increase to help the system work more efficiently, to provide more flexibility in the energy system. And uptake of these technologies, it's unlikely if people continue to perceive there to be very little benefit for the associated costs. To achieve this not only requires technology innovation to provide solutions, but also to solve infrastructure and technical problems, but it has to find a way to show that it can add real value to users, customers' lives. So there's a number of steps the energy sector can take to root out usability issues and ensure the infrastructure is in place to prepare for wider scale adoption. You can encourage businesses to create usable, holistic solutions. So, for example, tech neutral policies can force businesses to find a way to combine components into simple solutions. We can develop shared learning infrastructures to help speed up understanding, given that private industry has sort of specified that they're unwilling to publicize their own mistakes, for the benefit of others. These are naturally going to have to be publicly funded. The government should design markets that fold the value of increased flexibility to the right place in the system, including the demand side. Where exactly that is, that will come from these learning environments, but ultimately this will provide the evidence that's needed so that innovators can justify investing, because we can see that the business models ultimately stack up. There are a number of steps the energy sector can take. Allow innovation investment to improve user experience. So ultimately, we tend to get investment for improving various technological components. Why not broaden that to include improving usability? Clearly, the energy sector doesn't prioritize it at present. If this type of investment would help to de-risk products before they came to market. Help find a way for private industry to work together. So in exchange for this support, if this is going to be publicly funded, if we are finding a way to kind of bridge the gap here, ultimately industry is getting a lot for nothing, but ultimately there would be some leverage there to encourage them to voluntarily specify interoperability standards that the sector should, or their area of their technology should adhere to. Yeah, and you could perhaps set some timescales on that. It's put the ball in their court to agree what the standards are going to be. If they haven't done so by a certain time, then perhaps there's an option there to intervene. And yeah, and make sure the innovations work for all sorts of customers. Ultimately, taking these steps could help the sector reach a place where it's easy and enjoyable for all sorts of people to set up and operate smart home technologies, which is ultimately where we want to be. So yeah, just to summarize, so take steps to address the issues we know. So in particular, we need to consider how smart home technology is promoted and ensure that we're promoting a wide range of benefits to ensure what's promised is ultimately something which can be delivered. We want to make sure customers are supported in the onboarding experience so that they know how to operate the new system and get what they want from it. We need to be able to allow people to tailor their experiences. We're never going to be able to make a system that meets everybody's needs. You have to be able to allow them to modify their experience and so they can get value and use the system as they would like. Automation, it's, as I think the message, just to be clear, it's not that automation should be feared, it should be deployed cautiously. So basically, it should be transparent so users understand what's going on, and ultimately you're wanting to augment control, not take control. And if we do, and basically, if we want to uncover and address issues that haven't yet emerged, we can do that. But to do that, we need to encourage and enable those in the sector to work together, particularly private sector. We want to design markets to flow the value of flexibility to the right place in the system. And we want to invest in improving innovation to develop shared learning infrastructures. That is it.